the king of the north and the king of the south. Who are these kings that the Bible mentions in Daniel chapter 11? We already talked about Daniel 2, 7, and 8, and now we'll talk about Daniel 11. But before we begin, I want to tell you that this video will not cover the entire chapter 11 of Daniel, but it will cover the king of the north and the king of the south in the end times. If you haven't seen the previous videos, be sure to watch them because they complement each other. Daniel 11, 1-2 talks about the history of Medo-Persia, but starting in verse 3, it begins with the history of Greece. And in that verse, it talks about Alexander the Great. 4 describes the divisions of the Greek Empire. Now, in Daniel 11:5, we see the first introduction of the king of the south. And in verse 6, the king of the north appears. Okay, quick pause. Do you know why it's called the king of the north and the king of the south? Look at it this way. Israel is here in the middle, and north of Israel is the north. That's why it's called the king of the north, because it's north of Israel. The same with the king of the south. It's called the king of the south because it's south of Israel. Okay, this is easy. Wait, I'm not done. Now, I'm going to explain something else to you. It's very simple. The power that controls the geographical area of Egypt is the king of the south, and the power that controls the geographical area of Babylon, Assyria is the king of the north. We see a constant battle between the king of the north and the king of the south. But in the first verses, it refers to the Greek Empire of Seleucus and the Greek Empire of Ptolemy. Let's move on to verse 16. It says, "He who comes against him will do what he pleases, and no one will be able to stand against him. He will be in the glorious land, and it will be consumed by his power." The new kingdom presented as the one who comes is Rome. It's the new invader that will do what he pleases. The expression, "do according to his will," was used earlier to show Greece as the new power. Look at Daniel 10:20. It says, "The prince of Greece will come." The phrase, "he who will come," is in the context of the rise of an empire, and the rest of the verse describes Roman control over Jerusalem. So, at this point, the king of the north is Imperial Rome. Imperial Rome continues in verses 11:14 through 29. But something happens in verse 30. It says, "For the ships of Cyprus will come against him, and he will be grieved and will return." Grieved, in another translation, means will be discouraged or the collapse of the Roman Empire. Why did the Roman Empire fall? Several reasons. Number 1, the division of the empire. Number 2, the invasion of the barbarian tribes. One barbarian tribe that gave a severe blow was the Vandals. The conflict unfolded in the Mediterranean. God uses the symbol of Cyprus to represent the Mediterranean and the south, from where the ships of the Vandals set sail against the Roman Empire. Mr. Perez, so this verse is talking about the fall of the empire? Yes, exactly. Well, okay, but if Imperial Rome ceased to be the king of the north because of its fall, who was next? Okay, remember in the previous lesson when I said that Rome had 2 phases? No. Okay, Rome has 2 phases, an imperial phase and a religious phase. Let's see what the rest of verse 30 says. "He shall be grieved and return in rage against the holy covenant and do damage." So, he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. In the Old Testament, the holy covenant was related to the literal Israelite people in the flesh of the old covenant, from which the Messiah was born according to the promises. The new covenant of the New Testament refers to the people of God, which came to be known as Christianity, and which was first composed of Jews and then by Gentiles who accepted Jesus Christ as their Messiah, thus forming the Church of God or spiritual Israel. That is why the Holy Covenant mentioned here in the second part of verse 30 is no longer a reference to the people of Israel of the flesh who unfortunately rejected the Messiah, but a reference to Christian people. Now, how did Rome get angry with the Holy Covenant of the New Covenant? First, I want to remind those watching this video that I'm not talking about the brothers within this organization, but rather the system. I know there are possible brothers within this organization who truly love God, but let's look a little bit of history. First, let me introduce you to a figure you need to know. I present to you the famous Constantine the Great. Let me show you what this man did. I'm not going to make this video very long, so I'll try to keep this story short. This man was a Roman emperor who converted to Christianity. Christians were persecuted before, but it is said that he had a conversion, but this conversion was false for the following reason. He retained the title of Pontifex Maximus until his death, a title that Roman emperors bore as heads as the pagan priesthood. He had a triumphal arch erected that is decorated with images of victory from his battle against Maxentius, with trophies and sacrifices to gods such as Apollo, sun god, Diana, and Hercules. It contains no Christian symbolism. Even after his supposed conversion to Christianity in 312, he continued to honor the Sol Deus Invictus, the invincible sun god. Evidence of this can be seen in the coins Constantine commissioned. Mr. Perez? Yes. What does this Constantine dude have to do with the king of the north? Look at this. After Constantine did this, the government became mixed with religion. Bad idea, because there was a mixture of Roman paganism with Christianity. For the first time in history, Sunday was declared a day of rest by the government. Up until that point, all Christians had unanimously kept the Sabbath, and by making Christianity the official religion of its empire, and by imposing its Day of the Sun as a mandatory day of rest for all, Rome did according to its will, as the verse says. The verse ends by saying that Rome will show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. The Catholic emperors of Eastern Rome regarded, understood, or worked with the Western Roman Church, which had abandoned the Holy Covenant, with its truths and principles. Now, I am certain that is the papacy, because if you read verse 31, it says the following, "And forces will be mustered, raised up from him, and will defile or profane the sanctuary fortress, and will take away the daily sacrifice, so they will profane the sanctuary and take away the daily." The daily is something we already talked about. Mr. Perez, we already studied that in Daniel 8. Exactly. We're talking about the same power. So if you haven't figured it out, the king of the north is the papacy of the Roman Catholic Church. If you read verse 31, you realize that Rome has changed in its second phase, the religious phase. Verse 33 says, "And the wise men of the people will instruct many, and for certain days they will fall by the sword and by fire, by captivity and plunder." Once again, it recounts how Christians under the papacy suffered persecution through torture, burning alive, or being taken to prison. So, are you still with me? It's kind of a lot of information. Yeah, I know. Let's continue. Now, we're going to fast forward to verse 40 because we still need to know who is this king of the south at the time of the end. It says, "And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north will come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen and many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over." So, in this verse 40 is when the time of the end starts as per Daniel 11:40. Mr. Perez? Yes. Okay, so you're telling me that the time of the end began in verse 40? But how did that even happen and when? Very good question. In Bible prophecy, there's something we call the mortal wound. We talked about this a bit when I made the video on Daniel 7. We talked about a period of 1,260 years, or as the Bible says, time, times, and half a time. This was going to be the time that the religious Church of Rome would reign. Remember that in the Middle Ages and other centuries beyond, the Roman Catholic Church was supreme, especially in the government. It influenced the kings and politics of Europe. But in 1793, around those years, the French Revolution occurred. This revolution was very important because the ideas of this movement spread through the continent. I'm not going to mention all the ideas of the revolution, But one idea that most affected the Catholic Church was secularism. Secularism replaced religion. The French Revolution was no longer going to allow the state and religion together, but rather a separation. Let's look at this prophecy again. In Daniel 7, where it says time, times, and half a time, it's 1,260 years. It began in 538 when Rome was conquered by the Eastern Roman Empire, and it ends in 1798 because that was when the Catholic Church lost power to the countries of Europe. Look at it this way. The arrest of Pope Pius VI was a declaration by France that the government is above the church and that there is a separation. That was when the Catholic Church was giving the mortal wound. And when it was given the mortal wound, that's when the time of the end begins. Oh, okay. So in 1798, when the papacy is wounded, that's when the time of the end begins. That's right. But are you sure this year marks the end time? 100%. Because Revelation talks about how the mortal wound is healed sometime later, just before the second coming of Christ. Okay. Go on. We'll talk more about Revelation 13 another time. Okay, so we know who the king of the north is when the time of the end began. Now, who is the king of the south? The king of the south is no longer a power that controls Egypt, but he has the characteristics of ancient Egypt, just like the king of the north. The king of the north became the papacy and is no longer a territorial king as in the beginning. Although the papacy owns a small territory, the Vatican, its main influence is still spiritual. Let's read the following verses to understand who this king of the south is. Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help, who trust in horses and put their hope in chariots, for they are many, and in horsemen, for they are mighty. And they do not look to the Holy One of Israel, nor do they seek the Lord. And the Egyptians are men and not God, and their horses are flesh and not spirit, so that when the Lord puts forth his hand, the helper will fall, and the help will fall, and they will all faint together. Isaiah 31:1-3. It says here, people who do not seek the Lord. Exodus 5:2 says the following, and Pharaoh said, who is the Lord, that I shall obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, neither will I let Israel go. Egypt shows us a spirit against God. We could say atheism, secularism, rationalism, agnosticism, basically all the isms except Christianity. Let's see what happened in the year 1793. In 1793, by a solemn act of the legislature and the people, the gospel was abolished in France, and the French Constituent Assembly issued a decree banning the Bible. France has been the only nation on earth authentically recorded to have been a nation raised in rebellion against the author of the universe. France is the only nation in the history of the world which by a decree of legislative assembly declare that there is no God, a thing which rejoice all the inhabitants of the capital. So when the Pope is arrested by the French, this was the king of the south striking a blow against the king of the north. King James says, shall the king of the south push at him? Now, let's change the terms so we can understand. But in 1798, atheism, secularism, France, pushed the papacy. Now, atheistic influence didn't end in France. Yes, the king of the south was the French Revolution. Remember that the king of the south is the power that wages war against the king of the north, the papacy, and is against God, or rather, atheism. But this is important. From the French Revolution came the Russian Revolution and the birth of the Soviet Union. Communism is a direct descendant of the French Revolution. And this is how we see how the Soviet Union became the king of the south of the 20th century. Communism began to persecute Catholics in the territories that came under its control. The verse goes on to say, and the king of the north will rise against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen and many ships, and he shall enter the countries and will overflow and will pass through. It says the papacy was going to rise up against atheism like a whirlwind. When did papal Rome rise up against the atheistic and communist power of the Soviet Union? After World War II, the victorious powers became the world's protagonist, fighting for influence. It was capitalism versus communism. The Vatican and the United States joined forces to create a holy alliance against their common enemy, the Soviet Union. It is said that President Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II met secretly in Alaska in 1982, but the way they brought down the Soviet Union was as follows. The US was going to build up its military to such an extent that the Soviet Union could not compete. And if the Soviet Union spent all its resources competing against the US, its economy would collapse. And if its economy collapsed, there would be no more Soviet Union. Honestly, a good plan, because that is exactly how it happened. Look at this. 1 Kings 1:5. And he prepared him chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him. Chariots and horsemen mean an army. Psalm 107:23 says, they that go down to the sea in ships, and they do business in many waters. Ships represent a strong economy, but the papacy doesn't have an army or an economy. Right. That's why the Holy Alliance of the US and the Vatican came, because the papacy came against the King of the South with the US Army and its economy. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, it was flooded with American influence, as the verse says. Truth to be told, Bible prophecy is amazing. We know who the King of the North and the King of the South are. The King of the North is the papacy, and the King of the South is atheism, which began with France and all the countries that followed its ideas, like the Soviet Union. You know what? I'll make it simple for you. The King of the South is the atheistic secular power. Now, I want you to see something very interesting. In the US, we have seen how the spirit of the King of the South has taken control. Marriage between male and female couples have been legalized. Feminism has skyrocketed. Abortion has increased. Immorality has risen. We've seen how you could be canceled if you didn't call someone by their preferred pronouns. Male athletes competing in women's sports. Even the Pope has been very liberal. He has been very progressive and much more. But we've also seen the King of the North. Religion is gaining so much ground. You might say, but that's good. We need God back in our schools and government. Hold up. Not so fast. When the Vatican and the United States officially unite and pass a law requiring Sunday observance, ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of the world. This week, as I finished writing this, it came out in the news that the Pope has died. If the new Pope is a conservative Pope, we're approaching the final stretch of this world. In fact, this was described in the book The Great Controversy. Interesting fact, this book was written in 1888, and all the events we see today was foretold. If you don't have this book, I'll leave a link in the description. If you're watching this video, I want you to know that God has a plan for you. He loves you and wants you to trust Him. Come what may, whatever happens, trust Him and you'll be safe. If there's a message that I want you to leave today by watching this video, is that God loves you and He wants you in His kingdom. Do not delay your coming to God. Not for fear, because God offers you a purpose in your life. This has been the explanation of the King of the North and the King of the South in the end times. And may God bless you.